There's our Phyllite Scepter, the Myth of Generals. Well, that's appropriate. We don't have a general. Let's look at its description. There you go. It's encrusted with rectangular phyllite cabocons and menaces with spikes of phyllite, and on the image is an image of 2 floodgates in rhyolite. I think it's actually a psychic future prediction, because we're going to have 2 floodgates in our milling area when we're finally done. Okay, maybe not. Phyllite scepters are, fantastic. If I'm an adventurer, I can come along, pick up a scepter, stick it in my backpack, and move on. They are utterly useless in vanilla Dwarf Fortress. They have no function whatsoever. You can't sell them, you can't use them, and if you don't create an artifact vault, they sit in the workshop forever, or until somebody comes along and steals them, which is bad. So, let's go ahead and make sure our vault is dug out here. It's not quite finished yet. Let's get the vault finished, and once that's done, we'll get that scepter moved out to where it really belongs. Along the way, I also need to create a few things we haven't done. Let's create some more rock tables. And chairs to go with them. Let's create some boxes. Okay, and these containers are used for holding various things. We'll use the coffers in our hospital to hold thread, cloth, and splints and casts and crutches and so forth and so on. We'll use the coffin for holding dwarves after they make some really dumb mistake. We'll use cabinets and some of the coffers in the private bedrooms we're eventually going to give our dwarves so that they can store their old clothes, for example, and they don't end up littering the floor all over our fortress. Now, you might be wondering, there is no way, for the record, to create a repeating job within the manager by itself. If you want to create a repeating job, effectively a standing job that automatically turns itself on and off as there are things to do it, you want workflow, because dwarves will cancel jobs when they run out of materials. The workflow plugin for DF Hack will re-add them at some point down the future, and it will keep trying to re-add them until it reaches a certain level of material. I'm not going to demonstrate workflow right now. I haven't really used it much myself. I do know that if you wanted to, say, for example, set up a workflow where you had 100 thread at all times, you can set up a workflow that does process plants and then creates the thread, and anytime you fall under 100 thread, it will immediately start processing more plants and creating more thread. Likewise, you can do that with food and other items as well. Our engravers appear to have finished their initial task. Let's go up and take a look. See how this wall in this room looks a little different than the wall down below it? That's the difference between a smooth wall and a standard wall. It's important to smooth the walls in your dining room. And while it's not important to do it in the lever complex, they gain skill for doing it, and it's going to look nice when it's done, so we're going to go ahead and smooth that stuff as well. Smoothing the dining room will improve its value, so right now it's a fine dining room, and our bedroom is now a grand bedroom, so our dormitory is better quality than it was before. Once our dining room is finished being smoothing and we get some more tables in here, it will end up being a royal dining room, most likely, because we will have enough value in the room to make it royal quality. A royal dining room adds a significant amount of happiness to your dwarves. It will tend to shift dwarves by itself directly into the ecstatic category with that one happy thought alone. Oh, darn it, they've left 2 tiles behind. I gotta wait till they finish before I can build the artifact vault completely. Okay, let's get our ceramics industry up and running and get our metal workers creating the last items we will need for the remaining 6 forges that we need to get built. I don't need the extra 5 anvils. That's simply a fallback measure. They'll get stored in the furniture stockpile in case I need them at some later point. The 6 anvil job is the one that actually we're going to need to use to build our workshops. Are assigned randomly from the jobs. So the manager will approve this iron anvil job, and it'll be randomly assigned to an available workshop. If you need a job provided by a specific dwarf in a specific workshop with specific materials, don't use the manager. You can control all of those things manually if you want to dig down to that level of detail. You can control materials by linking stockpiles directly to a workshop. You can control which dwarves work in a workshop by either by skill level or by directly assigning a dwarf to a workshop. So effectively, you can control it to the degree that if I want to have a gold table encrusted in emeralds and a gold chair encrusted in rubies, and I want to make only emerald encrusted gold tables and only ruby encrusted emerald or ruby encrusted gold chairs for my dining room for whatever reason, and I want them all to be done by the most skilled dwarf in the fortress, I can assign that dwarf to the workshop, create a stockpile that only holds gold tables, create a stockpile that only holds gold chairs, create a stockpile that holds emeralds and rubies, and the dwarf doing those jobs, and link all those stockpiles to the workshop, and the dwarf doing those jobs will pull his materials only from the stockpiles I've created. So if I want to have only masterwork gold tables that are encrusted a specific way, you can do it. You can create a stockpile that only contains masterwork gold tables and link it to the workshop, and that workshop will only use what it's assigned to use. You have infinite control over what materials you assign, what events you get. Starting a fortress up, you don't need or want that level of control. Frankly, you're going to have much more higher priorities than worrying about whether you have encrusted gold tables in your dining room, for example. Later on, once your fortress is up and running, and you've got traps out the yin yang, and 6 squads of fully trained military, and there's not a whole lot that can really threaten your fortress, that's usually the point where you start gilding the lily, and you either start doing massive construction projects like a solid gold penis, or you do something like make your entire dining room out of one particular type of table, all masterwork, with one particular type of chair, all masterwork, all encrusted the same way, just to say you did it. To what degree you obsess over the output of your fortress, the structure of your fortress, is really a very personal decision. But for our purposes of our tutorial, I'm really just showing you how to get it set up. How far you want to take it, well, that's up to you guys. The best stories are going to be those fortresses where, they fought goblins for glory and had, a giant gold ziggurat sitting out on the lawn. People have talked about, I don't know if anybody ever actually did it, but people have talked about creating a pump stack inside a giant Armok statue that would swill magma from a mug and drain it down through the legs out of the map, so you could effectively pump magma up the arms into a mug where it would flow out and then down into the statue's mouth, so it looked like it was constantly drinking magma. I mean, if you're looking for, wild projects to undertake, Dwarf Fortress will let you build anything you can think of. It's just a question of whether you survive long enough to get to that point. For those of you who want to treat Dwarf Fortress as a building simulator, I guess this is a good time to bring it up. Out here in the init files, I sort of breezed past this initially when I was talking about this, at the very beginning. I said, there's all these init files out here, and I sort of breezed past one of them in particular. One setting in here that you may care about, I think it's in this one, yes. Say, for example, I want to treat Dwarf Fortress as a pure city simulator. I don't want to worry about defense, I just want to learn how an industry works, or I just want to spend time building without having to worry about an invasion. All you have to do is go in here and change invaders yes to invaders no, and you stop getting goblins, and you stop getting forgotten beasts, and you stop getting anything that's really going to threaten your dwarves other than starvation and magma. Whether you do that or not in order to do some major construction, that's up to you. If you want more challenge while you're building, leave the invaders on. If you want to do it and have no fear that you're going to lose your, super skilled mason because he's out there laying brick when the Goblin Siege arrives, well, then turn it off. Dwarf Fortress is your game. Play it how you want. For purposes of entertainment value, I'm going to leave invaders on so that we will eventually see Goblin Sieges and ambushes. Whether you play with them on all the time or not, the only person who's going to know is you guys. And you've already seen me make changes to the way the vanilla game plays in terms of eliminating children, for example, from pregnancies. What you do and how you do it is really your personal game. Now, we've just got another wave of migrants. Let's go ahead and read that. We go from 42 to 53, so we've got 11 migrants in this new wave. Several of them are also hunters. We'll have to deal with that problem. As always, I do the same thing every time a migration wave arrives. Everybody's peasants until I know otherwise. And when I go back to my peasants, I then reassign these guys who have military skill, the hunter skill that is, into the crossbowman squad I'm slowly building up. Oh, nuts. There's a good example of what you can do in a mistake. I haven't exported the professions yet. Let's do that before I forget, and that way at least the only forgetting I can do is actually uploading them. If you go into File in Dwarf Therapist, you can export custom professions. You may have noticed over here I have a whole list of custom professions I've built. They aren't necessarily the most efficient. They aren't necessarily the most effective. They're just what works for me. Your mileage may vary. However, I will go ahead and export them. And that will export them to a folder called to a file called Custom Professions of a type that's specific to Dwarf Therapist. I will go ahead and stick that in my Downloads folder, and I will export all of my professions, including the No Profession profession. At which point you can go nuts with these guys. I'm going to select them all. Export selected. It'll export my 23 custom professions. Ta-da! There it is. It's done. I'll upload them a little later. I'm not going to stop our stream just to do the upload, so bear with me. When you guys get that file, if you want to import them, there's an import professions from DF. There's also an import saved custom professions. If you create a profession manually in Dwarf Fortress, why you would do this, I have no idea, but you can. You can import it directly from Dwarf Fortress. Frankly, I find it a whole lot easier to build my custom professions in Dwarf Therapist and just do it that way. You still have to deal with the labor interface if you do it in Dwarf Fortress. You don't have to deal with the labor interface if you do it in Therapist. You guys have seen me using Therapist, so by now I'm sure you've kind of got an appreciation for how many button presses I'm saving by just assigning professions at the click of a button. One thing I didn't do when I was getting ready to cover, you remember I assigned these guys to a profession and then I hit Read Dwarves. Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's two buttons up here, Clear Pending and Commit Pending. If you don't commit the changes, they don't take effect, so these guys are still peasants. Okay, and we've got a set of 9 hunters, which is a whopping number. I'm not really using them for the hunting. I'm specifically using them to train up as military dwarves. You'll notice that my hunters steadily are gaining March Dwarf skill, for example. All of them have some, but the guy who started hunting initially is already up to a 9. They will hunt as long as they have ammo, and when they run out of ammo, they will stop hunting, and that's just what I want them to do. Our dwarves will come rushing in here. We'll have a few haulers who aren't doing anything in particular. We'll go ahead and let them do their thing. Let's go ahead and take a look and see who's idle. Once again, we've got our carpenter idle because we don't have any materials. Our mad docs need to make some more mechanics and or start building some traps, but we're not to that point yet. Our ceramics workers don't have any ceramics to build. Our metal workers are running down to the end of their jobs. And everybody else has pretty much got something to do at this point, so we're doing pretty good overall in terms of keeping our idle count fairly low. Let's go ahead and get our ceramics industry set up like I wanted to do earlier, And that looks just like the smelters when you're done. You're going to dig out holes of the same pattern as the smelters. And our miners will be along momentarily to open up the new area. Archery targets are safer than hunting, but there's a few catches. So typically what I'll do is I'll have them exhaust their initial supply of bolts, especially early in the fortress. Later on, I don't even care. Drop your crossbows and run for the gates, because I'm only going to leave them open long enough to get you inside. And then at that point, I don't care if thieves steal the stuff. But this early in the fortress, if an ambush did come along, if it bumbles into a couple of our hunters, the goblins are going to take some bolts, and they're probably going to retreat almost immediately. So for right now, we probably can get away with hunting. Worst case, we lose a couple of hunters to the first couple of ambushes, and, well, we'll make a couple slabs, or we'll build some coffins, and problem solved. Oh, speaking of which, there's a good example of something I didn't cover earlier that I need to. The Forbid menu under the Standing Orders screen. When you hit O for orders and you hit Forbid, you're going to see some Forbid options. These are auto forbids. Basically, under certain conditions, items will be automatically marked as forbidden. One particular nasty one here is that by default, death items are claimed. Turn that off. Turn it off, turn it off, turn it off. And the reason is because, say for example I had a hunter and a siege arrives and they kill the hunter. Every dwarf in the fortress immediately runs out to collect that dwarf's socks, because by God, socks are that important. Don't do that. Turn it off. If you want them to claim the socks later, all you have to do is go upstairs and mark them for reclaim. That's 2 seconds, and it's manual and safe to leave it that way. If you forget to mark the socks for reclaim, they sit up there forever. Nothing gets hurt. Nothing of value is lost. Nobody cares about a sock. Save your ants. Now, typically I will also mark my dead as forbid, and I will leave claim other dead as forbid other non-hunted dead. What you end up with is non-hunted dead are goblins, for example. They're not killed by your hunters, or if they are killed by your hunters, not considered hunted animals. The downside to doing it this way is if I lose a dwarf, I have to be careful. He won't be buried automatically. If I need to get him buried, I have to manually unforbid his corpse. If I want his items collected, I have to manually unforbid them. It's a bit more manual work, but deaths are fairly rare, and having dwarves all of a sudden having 40 haulers rush out after that siege, unarmed, unarmored, right into the face of a siege in order to collect some socks, suffice to say that it's just a recipe for disaster. Have all of these things set to forbid by default. Turn them on if you need them. Reclaim them manually. I've already placed the smelters. I talked earlier about the magma level that has to be at least a 5, or excuse me, at least a 4. We're up to 5s now. Once this finally hits 7s, the magma flow will effectively stop. My PC doesn't care about magma flow unless it's moving from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 2 in terms of evaporation. So we're back up to full FPS and we're running along. What I'm getting ready to do now, for those folks of you who are just joining us, is I'm getting ready to slap in the ceramics industry. So this is our glass smelters, or our glass furnaces, excuse me, and our kilns, our magma kilns. I'm not sure whether children automatically do hauling or not. I'd have to look. Frankly, I put my children in a burrow first thing. If I have kids, I like to build a burrow and just lock them into it so that they don't try to go wandering around the surface, because kidnappers will come along and steal your kids. Not a joke, by the way. The goblins actually raise dwarven kids as goblins. It's a semi-convenient way to get rid of some mouths, but not perhaps necessarily the most moral. I will discuss burrows a little later. Generally speaking, making a burrow for kids is no different than making a burrow for archers. All you do is make a burrow and assign people to it. What that controls is what jobs they are allowed to take. A dwarf who is assigned to a burrow will do no job that is outside the burrow. He can walk outside the burrow to do a job. For example, say I create a burrow and it has 2 sections and they are split. A dwarf can take a job in one half and use items from the other half, and he can cross the intervening space. But if a job is outside the burrow, if I create a workshop outside both burrows, and I only have the one dwarf, and I create a job and I make sure he's got the labor, he won't touch it. He'll ignore it like it doesn't exist. And you'll get spam cancel messages about, hey, I can't do that job. But he won't actually go and pick up the stones from outside the burrow, and he won't pick up items inside the burrow and use a workshop outside the burrow, for example. Burrows are a convenient way to make sure your dwarves are only doing the jobs you care about. It helps to be able to keep them inside that way. If a siege or an ambush were to show up right now, I would probably pause the game, create a burrow that was indoors, and assign all of my hunters to it manually to force them to try and get inside before the siege or ambush actually arrived properly. It may or may not succeed. I might very well lose them as they're trying to scramble back into the fortress, but at least I would have the effort then that they wouldn't just roam around on the surface continuing to try to hunt while the siege is stalking them, while the ambush is stalking them. Okay, ceramics industry. Right, that's where we were. Glass furnaces first. We'll do the glass furnaces over here. Glass furnaces have the same floor plan as the smelter. They have the same layout as the smelter. There's no practical difference in terms of construction between a magma smelter and a magma glass furnace. Build them pretty much the same way, use the same materials, whole 9 yards. Your mileage may vary in terms of whether you bother. You know, there's no sand on this map, so building 9 magma glass furnaces is really just an extravagance. There's no likelihood that I'm ever going to mass produce glass. If I collected sand for years and years, I probably still wouldn't have enough to power a glass industry for more than a few dwarf days, because once the dwarves get into the business of cranking out the glass, they're going to crank it out really fast. We will, however, want to create a massive kiln setup, because we do have clay on this map, and we will be able to mass produce clay items. Oops, that was Gabbro. I don't want to use Gabbro. I'm trying to be uniform here. Now, what I did with this 4th room over here is really up to me. I could make it into a stockpile, I could expand my smelting operations and run 18 smelters, or I could share it between extra kilns and smelters, or I could build extra forges. For right now, I'm just going to leave it empty, and we'll figure out what to do with it later. It's not going to hurt anything where it's at. And if I decide I need to expand one or more of my operations, I can do so. If I decide I need an extra stockpile, I've got it. We are going to go ahead and floor over that staircase. That'll get a nice dark blue floor from a boulder, and people will come along here momentarily to build up our kilns and to build up our glass furnaces, and then all of the holes that we've created that are not going to require a forge will be blocked off, and nothing will be able to get in except through the holes we haven't already covered up that will be covered up momentarily. Let's look at our jobs here. You'll notice our manager has not yet processed any of these other jobs that we need here. Let's see what he's up to. What's Tossid up to today? Tossid is managing work orders slowly. Okay, and with the Iron Shield job done and with the Hammer job done, let's check in on our military again. Let's go back in and look at their equipment and see what they've got. Remember, I assigned them all a Smasher uniform, so one thing you need to be aware of with respect to equipping, the squad that is first gets first dibs. The guy that is first gets first dibs. So, equipment is assigned to your dwarves from the first man of the first squad through the last man of the first squad, from first squad to last squad. So far, so good? Now, if I want to check that a particular squad has all of a given type of item, what I do is I go into that squad and I look at the last guy. And as you can see, this guy already has the steel shield or a partial match, because I set partial matches for this uniform, and an iron warhammer, because I set partial matches. If this was a steel warhammer, it would still mark it as complete. That means he has a warhammer. At this point, all of my dwarves, because this is the last guy in the first squad, all of my dwarves in this squad have a shield and a hammer. Some of them may have additional pieces, depending on what they started with and or equipped from other places. So, for example, the first guy in the list actually has a leather cloak. None of the other guys have leather cloaks at the moment. So he's the only guy that has any piece of the armor besides the weapon and shield that we created for them. Now, that's step one to training your military. You have to get them the necessary equipment. At the very least, you need to get them any shield or weapon that they're going to use. Armor user is useful and important, but you can add armor to them as they go while they are training with their weapon and shield. Having created a weapon and shield for all my dwarves, now's a real good time to start talking about a barracks. A barracks is created from an armor stand, or a weapon rack, or a bed, and it occupies a room just like a dining room would. And in this case, I'm going to use this room here for our barracks. This is going to become a checkpoint room as we descend further into the earth. I'm going to use this as a checkpoint. Only friendly things will come past this point back up into the main staircase of the fortress. At some point, I'm going to seal off the surface area that we have up there now, and all access will be through tunnels. My dwarves will be almost exclusively underground at that point. I won't be using hunters. My fishermen are already fishing indoors. My beekeepers will be indoors. My plant gatherers will have all the surface crops reduced to farm level. They'll go around picking plants in the caves instead of up on the surface. My traders will come down through tunnels into a depot I build. I will effectively remove my dwarves from the surface exclusively. Very Lord of the Rings, if you will. Now, checkpoint. We're going to make this into a barracks. So the first thing I want to do is actually build a stockpile that will hold weapons and armor. We will get rid of part of this stockpile in a moment, but we're going to build a bin and mark this as a stockpile specifically for those items that are used by our military. That's ammunition, but on ammunition, I only allow bolts. No arrows, no blow darts. The reason is because I don't want my military ever equipping a bow or a blowgun. You can't make the ammunition for those things yourself. You can only make bolts, so only crossbows are useful to your military. Likewise, I'm going to enable weapon, trap components, and armor. But I'm going to go back up to trap components and I'm going to say, no, I don't want this. I don't want any of these trap components things. Just weapons. And in addition, I only want those weapons that I'm actually going to equip my dwarves with. I can't make whips, but I can make battle axes and warhammers and so forth. And so typically what I'll do is I'll actually disable all of, I will forbid all of the weapons, and then go back and re-enable only those weapons that I care about. Battle axes, warhammers, spears, crossbows. Most of these other items I either can't make or don't care about. I don't want my dwarves using them. I will allow picks, although none of my military will use picks, because this is a convenient place to store them, and I'm not going to make a separate stockpile for them. I don't care what material they're made out of. I don't care what quality they are. If I did, I can modify all of what's allowed to be stored here, so I can make sure that only iron short swords are in this stockpile if I wanted to, but right now, I don't care. All weapons go, all armor goes. Now, likewise with armor, this is for my military stockpile. So, I only want to have those items that I'm actually going to equip my military with. So again, I go through and I forbid all the types and enable only those things that I want my dwarves to actually equip. And like that, I've gotten all of these. Now, in addition, I make sure that only usable armor and usable weapons show up in the list. Some items aren't usable by dwarves. That's just one more filter I like to add. It is possible to get whips from goblins. It's probably possible eventually to get them from merchants, but you probably aren't going to get them in any significant quantity. And so training a squad of lashers, for example, means that you have to first A, decimate a squad of goblin lashers, and then B, assign lashers as a uniform, and then C, have all the whips necessary to equip them as lashers, and then D, train them to be lashers. If you want to, it's kind of like having gold ruby encrusted tables. Do you want to do it? You can. Is it the most effective way to get a fortress set up? No, probably not. Concentrate on the stuff that you need to do just to get up and running, and then later on go back and embellish as you see fit. I don't know that I've ever actually seen a merchant carry a whip. I suppose it's technically possible. Typically, I encounter whips in the hands of goblins. Whips are actually far more dangerous as weapons than you might think. Whips should be treated like lightsabers. Whips should be treated like guns on handles, because the way Dwarf Fortress calculates the physics of its attacks currently, whips have a very small contact area, i.e. just the tip of the whip, and they have a very fast speed, i.e. the speed of a whip breaks the sound barrier, and so effectively a whip is like a bullet on a string, and literally they can punch holes in things like armor that a real whip couldn't possibly touch. At some point, Toady will fix that, but, you know, for right now, whips should be treated like they are utterly, totally, completely lethal weapons. Goblin lashers with high skill can really make mincemeat out of armored dwarves, despite what you would expect to happen in such a case. Likewise, there's warhammers are better than maces in almost all cases. Short swords are a combination of an axe, a spear, and a mace, but they're not as good as any of those weapons in general. Bows and blowguns you can't make the ammo for. Pikes, halberds, two-handed swords, long swords, mauls, great axes, you can't usually... Some of your dwarves won't be able to equip them because they're too small. Your larger dwarves may be able to use them, but getting a squad of dwarves who is both large enough and enough two-handed swords, for example, for your dwarves to equip them all, it's one of those, do you want to have a squad of lashers or not kind of questions. Daggers work, but if you're going to get daggers, you might as well get spears. Scourges are effectively whips, except better. Flails and morning stars are kind of like maces and war hammers, except you can't make them. Scimitars are like short swords, except you can't make them. Axes, training swords, and training spears are made out of wood. They are weapons only in the very loosest sense of the word. However, there is an... melee weapons have no range. Melee weapons have range of you are standing on your target. There is no advantage in terms of range unless you're using a ranged weapon. Only ranged weapons have range. So it's not like you're going to have a lasher attacking dwarves from 3 squares away and ducking away, you know, like some D&D 30.5 edition half ogre with a spiked chain cheese kind of thing. Training weapons have one use that we will probably get to either this episode, next episode, or sometime in the future, where I will capture live goblins, disarm them while they're still in cages, put the cages into an arena, assign my squads all to have training weapons, release the goblins from their cages, and sick the training weapon-equipped dwarves on the goblins. The goblins will proceed to get the snot pummeled out of them by a bunch of guys with wooden weapons, and because it will take longer for the armored goblins to die, we get a lot more training out of it than we would if we used live steel. So, training axes and training swords and training spears are theoretically things I will equip my dwarves with. Note that there is no such thing as a training hammer. If you want to build a training hammer, you need an incredibly lightweight material, and you build a warhammer out of it. That's what a training hammer is. So, if I wanted to train my spear dwarves, for example, I can give them training spears and sick them loose on targets. Training spears and regular spears work just the same for training purposes, but they do not work the same for combat purposes. If I intend to have my dwarves in combat at any point, it's better to just go ahead and give them regular spears up front. There are no training fatalities in modern versions of Dwarf Fortress. earlier versions of Dwarf Fortress would occasionally have situations where a sparring dwarf would actually injure his sparring partner. That has been removed. It is no longer the case. Sparring is 100% safe, assuming you're not having them spar on a bridge over a deep pit. Training your dwarves by forcing them to spar over a pit of magma is not advisable, but could be funny. Okay, with ammo, weapons, and armor assigned to the stockpile here, bins assigned to the stockpile, this will eventually become our barracks and our military item storage. One thing it does not do is it does not allow clothing storage. Right now we don't actually have a clothing industry at all. We'll need to get one up and running fairly soon. It looks like I forgot to enable bins in the clothing and leather stockpile. Let's get that done too. Dwarves will eventually go insane if you let them become naked due to their clothing wearing out. So that's one of those things you're going to have to watch out for. It won't happen in the first year. Probably wouldn't happen in the first 2 years. I don't know exactly how long your clothes take to wear out. But we're going to start this year cranking clothes out en masse so that as soon as a dwarf gets worn clothing, he immediately goes and replaces it, and we never tempt fate. Give me just a second, guys. I'm going to walk away from the keyboard for a second. The cat needs out of the room. He got in here without me realizing it, and I've locked him in with me. And he looks like he really needs to go. So give me a second, and I'll be right back. Yes, like the great and powerful Toad, I do in fact have a pair of cats. I love cats in real life, hate cats in Dwarf Fortress. It's not hard. Toady has coded them specifically to be as annoying as possible. Sorry, but I don't usually have cats in my fortresses. Question was asked about when do you build stockpiles, and how many of them do you create, and how many do you create per stockpile. And the answer is you are limited to a maximum of 3 wheelbarrows per stockpile no matter what you do. You can get around that by building smaller sub-stockpiles effectively and having each one have 3 wheelbarrows. So for example, if I wanted a giant stone stockpile and I wanted to have 10 or 12 dwarves stocking it, I could build 10 small stockpiles, which would act as input stockpiles to the final stockpile, and assign each of the input stockpiles 3 wheelbarrows, and I'd have 3 dwarves working on each of them all the time, and effectively I could control exactly how much population I was using. I don't typically use wheelbarrows initially. Wheelbarrows are only valuable for particularly heavy items, so for example stone. I normally don't have a stone stockpile right off the bat. Stockpiling stone is just not really that important early in your fortress life. At this point, though, I've got a mason/stone crafting area right here, and you can see I've got a massive stone stockpile that's basically full. Anytime I need stones, my dwarves are taking like 2 steps, picking up a rock, and walking right back to make whatever it is I need them to make. That keeps them busy and keeps the haulers having something to do. Likewise, down here in the basement, I'm going to go ahead and, if I don't have a mechanism creation job queued, I'm going to see if I've got some spare mechanisms just floating around in the fortress. It looks like I've got a handful, but not many. So we're going to go ahead and get some mechanisms created as well, so we can get our weapon traps built. We've got our forges up and running, and I don't know that the anvil job is actually started yet. I think that we haven't got that approved yet, so we're going to promote that all the way to the top here. That way the anvil job gets promoted first. In addition to, I should cover this, and I didn't mention it earlier. In addition to the order of jobs being approved, this is also the order in which jobs are assigned. So if I now added another job that would go to a forge, the anvil jobs get assigned first. That's not to say they'll be completed first. If circumstances arise such that cancellations occur, or I manually went in and canceled the anvil jobs first, other jobs could be sitting in queue, and those would effectively get in the workshop and would effectively get moved to the top. If you want to make sure a workshop never receives jobs to create an item, fill the workshop with jobs on suspend, or fill the workshop with jobs on repeat, and that job will never get assigned to that. However, it's not possible to keep a workshop job from being, or a manager assigned job from being assigned to a workshop, even if that workshop can't do it by virtue of, say, for example, stockpile linking. If I had a workshop whose sole function was to make ruby encrusted gold tables, well, then that job is not going to be, it's not going to, and then I assign a job to cut gems, for example, it'll get assigned potentially to that workshop, and that workshop is linked to stockpiles that don't have raw gems in them, and therefore I can end up with a situation where a job is assigned to a workshop that can't even do it. Cats, someone asked about cat explosions. If you're not familiar with cats in Dwarf Fortress, cats breed prodigiously, they do not require grazing, they hunt vermin, they go everywhere, and they can potentially bear multiple litters. The problem you run into is that cats also cannot be stopped from adopting dwarves and becoming pets. You can't butcher pets, so once a cat becomes a pet, it is effectively safe from most normal means of elimination. That means you get cats that produce cats that adopt dwarves and become more pets that produce cats, and so forth and so on and so such, and there's not really a good built-in way to monitor your cat population. You can't spay or neuter your cats, unfortunately. There's a couple of ways around it. You can atom smash them with a drawbridge, kick them into lava. All of these have the negative emotional consequences on their owner, if they have owners. Before they adopt a dwarf, they are still eligible for butchery, as are all standard animals. You can use the DF hack tool. Hang on a minute, I forget the exact name here. Auto Butcher, that's the one I'm thinking of. You can use Auto Butcher to assign all female cats to butchering, for example, at which point you'll never have a cat explosion. You could assign it such that you always have one female cat and one female adult cat and all but one juvenile cat gets butchered. That still won't fix the pet problem. So once a cat becomes a pet, even as a kitten, for example, you're stuck with it. It's strongly recommended that you strongly recommended by me personally, that you avoid cats in general in your fortresses. Love them in real life, hate them in fortresses. Okay, at this point our ceramics industry is pretty much up and running. Our manager is eventually going to get around to approving our anvil job. Let's look and see how we're doing on tables and chairs. Okay, we need about 4 more chairs to catch up with our number of tables, but we're doing pretty good here. Our rooms are now a great dining room, which is good, but we're not done yet. Oh, and I forgot. Our vault is ready. Let's get our vault populated with something useful, like useless phyllite scepters. Typically what I will do is go through and enable everything with equality. and then I will disable everything that's not an artifact. At this point, any artifacts that are created in the fortress will be moved into this chamber for storage. I'll even put bins in here because why not? Why not jam all your artifacts into one bin? Okay, at this point our artifact Phyllite Scepter will eventually be migrated into the vault, and at that point, there goes our bin. May or may not have the scepter already in it, I don't know. But at that point, the scepter is out of sight, out of mind, deep in the fortress where it's not going to be stolen or pilfered by thieves. It's just a base bin, so there's nothing in it yet. Our scepter is still sitting upstairs somewhere. That armor stand that I just queued up is what we're going to use to build our barracks down below. Once we've got the barracks, we can actually start training our military. We've got them, you know, semi-equipped, but we need to go ahead and start looking at training and getting them some proper armor. At this point, we're going to have to step up our efforts to find and acquire iron. We've got plenty of iron sitting up here, but we need to make sure we're getting it moved down into our stockpiles efficiently and being smelted efficiently. Looks like we've got lots and lots of iron just sitting around. This is a good time to go ahead and start talking about three things: putting your smelting jobs on repeat and melting. I covered melting briefly in terms of being able to melt things down, but here's a little tidbit about melting as we go. First off, let's say I wanted to melt an item. The item will, say, return half a bar of metal. That half a bar sits in the smelter it was smelted in, and it will sit there until it gets the equivalent of another half bar before it creates a full bar. So, say for example, I melted a silver dagger and it got half a bar. I could then melt 14 other items of different materials, but I still only have half a bar of silver sitting in the smelter. If I melted a second silver dagger and got another half bar, I would then subsequently get a single bar of silver, and that would be that. Now, if something added up to more than a full bar, like say it added up to 1.2 bars, for example, I would get a bar and there would be 0.2 of a bar sitting in the smelter. The addition is not across smelters. A single smelter is separate from all of the other smelters. So we end up with, if I smelt 2 silver daggers, but I smelt each one in a separate smelter, I'm going to have half a bar in 2 smelters rather than a full bar. Generally speaking, if you're going to do melting, you want to do your melting in one smelter. With our jobs on pause here, let's go in and take a look at the stock screen. Let's get that dagger melted while we're at it, while we're thinking about it. I'm just using the melt key here to mark those things for melting. Likewise, I'm going to replace all of these existing crossbows, except the steel ones probably, with iron crossbows, which are heavy and more valuable than the copper or bronze, for example. But I won't do that just yet. I'll leave those as is. Now, marking things for melting does not automatically get them melted down. You have to add the melt a metal object task. Typically, when I add that, I will do it on one smelter and put it on repeat. That will continue to have that smelter be our melting smelter. Notice it's this one right here at the beginning of the smelter area. It makes it easy to track and remember. That's the only purpose in making it this one. I then add hematite ore and copper ore because those are the types of ores I see large numbers of sitting here in my smelting area waiting to be smelted. And I will add several of them so that we can get many, many people doing much smelting here. And our hauler count is going to, our idle count is going to drop by quite a bit as the massive influx of haulers to do all of our smelting kicks in. In addition, the 3 wheelbarrows are going to suddenly be employed, moving the stone back into the stockpiles to keep up with the demand from the smelters. When the smelters run out of ore in the stockpiles, they will actually start migrating up to the upper area and moving it down manually for themselves. They don't have to have it in the stockpile. Quality of a pick, someone asks if that has any impact on mining, and the answer is no, it does not. The humans just arrived, and their caravan skipped us. Now, you might be wondering, what the heck's going on there? Well, the traps we've built in this corridor block wagons, so the wagons can't actually get into the fortress because there's traps in the way. The good news is those traps will help pick off some intruders. The bad news is that they keep out the wagons. Eventually, we'll build a better quality depot entrance that will have both a trapped and non-trapped segment, so that we can both get the wagons into our depot without having to forfeit the security and safety of our entrance. Something I didn't do here, we need to get our war dogs assigned properly here. Let's go ahead and remove the first 2 from this pasture, 1, 2, and get them assigned to the chains, the ropes that I built up there a long time ago, so that they can spot intruders before they get into the fortress proper. We'll get 1 assigned to that chain and 1 assigned to this chain, and that will be that. Someone will come along momentarily, move them from the pasture to the chain, and we'll have war dogs stationed out front to spot intruders. And our merchants, see, here's why you want to have dogs out front. Watch the kobold very closely. Notice the dogs chasing him? Dogs will chase out of their pasture for a limited distance and then they will retreat. Someone will come along momentarily and move the dog back to the pasture. If you don't want the dogs to go completely walkabout, you've got to make sure that the thieves get scared off by dogs that can't chase them. Hence the reason why I've got dogs chained up outside. We did, in fact, add levers to the bridges. I can verify this because I can go downstairs to our levers and look at their contents. A linked lever will have 2 mechanisms in it. An unlinked lever, 2 or more, I should say, mechanisms in it. An unlinked lever will only have the mechanisms in it that it was used to build it. So, for example, both of these are linked up. They're linked to those bridges you saw up on the surface, so our customs area is up and ready. We've got the zone that we have to build inside it to handle. That's our temporary meeting area. I set that as a meeting area, but I turn it off temporarily. That meeting area is so that when I have a fortress sealed up, I can open the outer doors, turn on this outer meeting area, and the migrants will make their way to this meeting area. And then once all the migrants are inside the drawbridge, I can close the outer drawbridge and open the inner drawbridge, turn off the meeting area, and the migrants will move from this meeting area down into the dining room like normal citizens. Once they're all out of the input customs gatehouse area, I can seal up the bridges back the other way and be back to a secure area. We have not yet built the well. Someone was asking if we've built our well yet. The well is flooded and ready for construction. We haven't actually built the well as a building yet. That's one of the things I was getting our forges up so I could do this out of metal chains, metal buckets, and metal blocks for the high value that they represent. Okay, this armor stand is going to be where we get our dwarves' barracks created. You only need one armor stand. Having multiple armor stands, weapon stands, beds, and so forth in a barracks contributes to your dwarves' happiness by virtue of them having lots of things around to admire, but doesn't necessarily make a barracks better or worse. Someone asked whether thieves can be caught in cage traps or hurt by traps, and the answer is, well, it depends. Some critters, and I think thieves are among them, have the quality of being able to avoid traps. Traps don't trigger when they step on them. This is true of some various types of critters. It's true of some types of infiltrators, like kobolds can basically walk right across traps like they don't exist. Generally speaking, you don't depend on traps. Traps are simply a solution in your toolbox, not the solution in your toolbox. I have cage traps, but you'll notice in addition to the cage traps, I have a mass of dogs just inside those cage traps. So if something does get in, the dogs theoretically are going to immediately ambush and attack it, and while the dogs are busy attacking it, I'm going to mobilize my military. Let's get our trader out and get him busy doing the trading thing we want to have him do. They'll migrate the trap components that we built at the very beginning of our embark that we're still using as our sole source of trade goods even a year later. You'll notice our broker is busy managing work orders because he's also our manager. This is the problem with having your broker doing other tasks. So let's fix that problem. Kivish Amenfath, today is your lucky day. You are now a manager. He's also a doctor, so he's really not got a whole lot of other tasks to perform. Good news is that our broker is now free of his management tasks. Bad news is he just went downstairs and took a nap. I don't recall whether trap avoid critters will trigger pressure plates. I think since pressure plates are based on weight, you can force them to trigger pressure plates. But remember, you can't build a trap and a pressure plate on the same square, so there's no way to get a trap to trigger on a kobold, for example, because even if they trigger the pressure plate, they're not on the trap at the time. You can, theoretically, time it such that a critter activating a pressure plate activates a bridge, and because of the delay between the pressure plate and the bridge activation, you can time it so that a bridge falls on the kobold as he steps off the pressure plate, I think. I've never actually tried it, but you probably could if you wanted to have an automated Atom Smasher. But frankly, Atom Smashers are dangerous, and having an automated one sounds like a recipe for having missing dwarves. So yeah, I probably wouldn't do that, but you theoretically could. You can also rig a pressure plate such that it would trigger a trap that kills other intruders. So, for example, in the middle of a siege, you could have a pressure plate that's activating one of those spear spike traps, and effectively you could force all the spear spike traps to trigger every time a goblin runs across a pressure plate. So you could have a pressure plate and then a whole bunch of spike spear traps, and the first goblin across would trigger it, and the second goblin across would turn it off, and the third goblin across would spike both of his buddies, and then the fourth goblin across would turn it off, and the fifth goblin across would spike all his, or the sixth goblin across would spike all his buddies. Yeah, or you could have a bridge that, closes whenever a pressure plate is hit, and therefore flings them in. But the problem is pressure plates are on-off. So the first guy that triggers it would fling everybody, and the second guy that triggered it would open it back up, and the third guy would fling everybody, and pressure plates are a little harder to use than they might first appear. You can certainly make them work. I'm not suggesting that pressure plates should not necessarily be part of your defense. We will actually use pressure plates when we start creating our goblin grinder. I will demonstrate how I use pressure plates for purposes of entrapping foes in an area that they don't want to be in. Meanwhile, our hunters have been busy.